Hello and welcome to the Reactive Dog Pod. I am your host, Tess Morgan. I am a multi-certified dog behavior consultant who specializes in the treatment of reactivity in dogs. Through my business, Treat Yourself Dog Training and Behavior, I help clients make progress and enjoy life again with their reactive dogs. Join me and my guests as we dive into all things reactivity. We'll explore behavior concepts, talk about real-life training plans and considerations for reactive dogs, provide tips and tricks, and discuss how we can best help reactive dogs and their families thrive. Because reactive dogs are good dogs, they just need a little bit of extra support. Let's get into it. Although there are many different training plans and methodologies for working through reactivity, I want to talk about the two exercises that are used and discussed, I would say most commonly when we're talking about helping reactive dogs using positive reinforcement-based training. So today I'd like to talk about engage, disengage, and look at that. Both of these methods involve some form of looking toward the trigger while your dog is under threshold as a main tenet of the exercise, but there are some key differences that I'd love to get into so that you, as listeners working with your reactive dogs, can be as informed as possible going in. I use both engage, disengage, and look at that regularly. I have good success with both methods, and I'm also a certified Control Unleash instructor, which means that I have been mentored by Leslie McDevitt, who created the Look at That game. So I'm going to try my best to do both of them justice, but I know that I may mess up some aspect of it. So please forgive me if I do, and feel free to let me know. So Look at That is a training exercise developed by Leslie McDevitt as part of her Control Unleashed series. This is a series of books and DVDs back when we were watching DVDs that has been hugely influential in the positive reinforcement dog community. It's the book that gave us pattern games, which I'm sure that you have heard of if you've been looking into reactive dog training for some time. And it also gave us Look at That. So basically the premise behind this exercise is that it aims to turn your dog into what Leslie calls a reporter. And so what that means is that instead of reacting, barking, lunging, etc., to triggers in their environment, we're aiming to have your dog essentially report that trigger to their handler and be rewarded for doing so. So the goal of this is less about actually looking at the trigger as a behavior and more about giving your dog a way to have a conversation with you where they communicate to you, hey, I see the trigger over there, and you say, okay, thank you, here's a reward for kind of letting me know. So the dog is still able to look at the trigger and kind of let you know that they're there, but they don't feel as concerned about them, and it kind of gives them a job to do around the trigger. This can be done, this reporting can be done by having your dog glance at the trigger. They might turn their head toward the trigger. They might flick their ear, or sometimes it's even more subtle than that. But really, it's anything that tells you that the dog is orienting towards or noticing the trigger. I always, when I'm teaching Look at That, I always emphasize that your dog does not need to fully kind of turn their head and stare at the trigger. And that if they are doing that, then, if they're relaxed, I'm fine with it. But we don't want to wait for our dog to full on kind of shift and stare at the trigger, because what we don't really want is to reinforce our dog for staring. We want to reinforce our dog for noticing and then kind of moving on. If they are staring at the trigger, that tells me you're probably too close or something about the situation is too hard. But we also don't want to intentionally be reinforcing like long, hard stares at the trigger as much as these little kind of orientations. Look at That also uses a cue. And so that's a verbal, basically a verbal question that you ask your dog so that they can kind of start the game and start pointing the trigger out to you. So I teach this, and I would say most people teach it as where is the. So we teach the dog that when you say, where is the dog, or where is that person, or where is that bike, they are to kind of point that bike or that dog or whatever the trigger is out to you. I've had some people just say, look at that to prompt the dog to look at the thing. I like where is, but honestly, as long as you're consistent, it's fine. Um, the dog also may be rewarded for pointing out something to you without the cue. So it might just be that the dog sees the thing before you, and your dog, you notice that your dog is looking at you and kind of pointing something out, and you can still reward them for that. So you don't need to always have the cue, but technically when we're teaching the game, that is kind of part of the process, is adding that cue in. I also really like it as a like I don't want to say warning, because warning sounds scary, but as you know, if a dog is easily startled, when a dog is coming and they haven't seen it yet, but you have, or you know, any type of trigger where it might startle them if they don't kind of know that it's coming. I like to use it to kind of give the dog a heads up. Hey, there's a dog coming, just so you know, because that can help with that kind of startle element that can be so difficult for reactive dogs. Typically with Look at That, we do train it using a neutral object. And so that's something that your dog is not scared of, and or reactive towards. And it's also probably something that your dog isn't super excited about. So examples of neutral objects, it could be something like a water bottle, a hairbrush, a candle, a book. So it's really something that your dog doesn't care about and has like pretty much no previous association about. And this is because we want the dog to essentially have that foundation for the game and learn what the game is and how to have that kind of two-way conversation with you before there's that pressure of that trigger being there. And this is the case for most training, is we want to teach the behavior in a no or low distraction environment before we try to integrate anything that's potentially scary or problematic. I teach the Look at That game in my pattern games for reactivity and fear group class. So this is a virtual group class where we work on Control Unleashed exercises, for specifically for dogs who are fearful or reactive. And I use that neutral object to teach the game. The thing about the neutral object is that it's a really great exercise. It can be difficult though, especially um, if you're not, you know, used to training dogs and you don't have that much experience, because it's, you know, it is helpful for the reactivity, but it's also in itself a training exercise. And what I find is, with people who are struggling with this, a lot of the time the problem is that you need really good timing, to kind of click or say yes exactly when your dog is looking at the thing. And you also, sometimes if a dog has been reinforced a lot for looking at us and engaging with us, it can be hard to even get them to look at that thing that they have no kind of concern about. In the real world, when you're practicing around a trigger, even if you're at an intensity or a distance that is far enough away for your dog to be okay, they still are going to be more likely to notice the trigger than some random object that they have no association with. So it can be a really good exercise for you as a trainer to practice with that neutral object. And it's also helpful for the exercise when you're working with triggers. So to just kind of describe how the exercise is taught for anyone who like has never heard of Look at That or has never taught it before, typically we're using a clicker or a marker word. So I use the marker word yes, as do many trainers. But a lot of people also use a clicker or another marker word. You could use good. Usually we want to use a marker word that is one syllable so you can mark a really quick moment in time when your dog does something. But typically we're starting with that neutral object, and we are essentially rewarding our dog for noticing it. And so again, noticing could be any type of orientation. It could be glancing at it, tilting their head towards it, moving their ear towards it, anything that tells us that they've noticed it. And then we're feeding them. And we're starting, with the object kind of being moved out from behind our back so that we have that movement to encourage our dog to look at it. And then we're slowly kind of fading, us holding the object out of the picture until our dog can do it with the object completely separate from us. Engage Disengage was developed by Alice Tong and is actually based on the Look at That game. So the Look at That game came first, and then Alice essentially kind of took the Look at That game and put her own spin on it. So unlike the Look at That game, Disengage is typically practiced with triggers right away, and it doesn't have that kind of necessary neutral object practice first. That being said, I often coach clients to practice with a toy or a more neutral item first so they kind of understand how the game works. They can practice their timing and learn with their dog without the pressure of that real trigger being there. Typically at a session, sometimes I'll even do stuff like shuffle my feet, assuming the dog isn't scared of me. So I might be a little bit more careful about this if the dog was nervous of myself. But if they're not nervous of me, I might teach it, by saying, okay, when I pull my hand out from behind my back and wave and the dog notices that, you can use that as a distraction. Or you could do the same thing as you're doing with Look at That, where you're using kind of a neutral object that your dog isn't scared of or too excited about. Typically, engage, disengage works in two steps. And so the engage step, essentially, we're going to use that clicker or that marker word that I mentioned, and we're going to set up in a situation where your dog has enough distance or the trigger is at a low enough intensity for them to be under threshold. And what under threshold means, if you're not familiar, is just that they're relaxed enough to like listen to you, to hear what you're saying to them, to disengage from the trigger. So they're not so kind of far gone that they're starting to get concerned about the trigger or reactive. And when our dog notices that trigger, so it could be looking, it could be any type of kind of orientation towards the trigger, we're going to say yes, or we're going to click and we're going to give them a treat. And so that's the first step of the game, the engage part. And engage, we typically repeat until we're getting a dog that more than half the time, I like to go for even closer to 70-80% of the time, the dog is noticing the thing, you're saying yes or clicking, and then they're looking back at you. That's kind of the first step. But what we really want before we move on is that the dog is noticing the thing and looking back at you without being prompted. So we want the dog to be able to offer that kind of second step, which is disengage, before we officially kind of require that of them in the training. And so you're kind of going through that first step. Your dog is noticing the thing, you're marking yes, or you're clicking, you're feeding, and you're looking for, okay, is my dog offering to disengage quickly every time that I say yes, or are they even kind of jumping the gun and disengaging before I can even mark? At that point, we do want to move on to the disengage side of the game. And what that means is that we're going to allow our dog to look at the thing. We're going to give them some time to look away from the thing on their own. So looking away from the thing on their own is it I honestly I love the disengage side of it, and I'll talk a little bit about that more. But there are some caveats there. So if your dog is looking at the thing for a long time, if their body language changes, so maybe they're looking at the thing and they start to look stiffer, maybe their weight shifts kind of forward towards the thing. We're getting hard eyes, so that means your dog's eyes are looking really intense and kind of staring and fixating on the thing. And really any sign that our dog is not okay while looking at the thing. In that situation, I might stick at that first step, and I also might change something about the training setup to make it a little bit easier for the dog. Um, but essentially, if the dog is able to look at the thing, stay relaxed, no signs of stress, just looking at the thing. We're going to wait and see if they can disengage on their own, and then we're going to yes or click for the disengage. And the disengage doesn't have to be looking at you. So I think some people probably teach this game by requiring that the dog kind of checks back in with them after looking. Personally, I'm fine with the dog disengaging at all. So that means that the dog could look at the thing and then look at the ground. The dog could look at the thing and then look at something else. I don't care what the other thing that they're looking at is, as long as they're disengaging. Because I love dogs to check in with me. Obviously, that's one of the ways that we can make a lot of progress and that we can really feel like, oh, wow, this training is working because my dog is checking in with me so much. But for me, I'm also thinking about, okay, yes, checking in is great, but I'm also thinking about what's the big picture here? Do I want a dog who checks in with me every time they see a trigger? Yeah, sure, that's a great goal. But I also want a dog that genuinely feels okay about the trigger enough to disengage and do something else. So what I'm trying to say here is that checking in after they see the trigger is great, but I almost more so want them to be able to look at the trigger and just do something else. Because if you think about how you behave when you're not worried about something, you look at the thing and then you look away and you carry on your day, right? That's what I want the dog to do. I want the dog to be able to check out the thing and then move on. And so I want to reinforce any type of disengaging. Some trainers have rules about how long they're going to allow the dog to look at the thing before disengaging, like, 5 seconds, 3 seconds. Personally, for me, if the dog is not escalating in their body language and we're not seeing any negative repercussions of staring at the thing, I'm okay to let them check out the thing for as long as they want and look away when they're ready. Some people may not agree with this, and that's okay. I find that I see the most progress when dogs are allowed to observe the thing from a safe distance and process it and make their own decision of when they're ready to look away. Might we watch the dog if they're staring a lot and it's not trending better and we're just getting tons and tons of really long, like prolonged staring? Yes, we want to keep track of that and kind of see where that trend is going, because ideally we do want a dog who can check it out and look away quickly, like more quickly over time. But I am a big believer in letting dogs check things out for as long as they need to process it. And so I'm a big fan of just allowing that. But you may find a trainer who disagrees, and that's okay. As long as we're being kind to the dog and making progress, that's their prerogative. I usually try to move to the disengage part, um, as quickly as I can, and that means if the dog is comfortable and making progress and I'm happy with how they're doing, um, because I really like that kind of observing and processing part. However, some dogs will need to stick at that first step for a while to get kind of to understand the game, to start to feel better about the trigger, and to even kind of be able to look at the trigger for a prolonged period and then disengage. And so if your dog can't disengage, again, we want to think about what's too hard about this, that they can't disengage, but we also may just want to stick at that step for longer, until we move to that second kind of disengage step. I find this exercise very simple for clients to execute. And that's not to say that look at that is not simple. But as I mentioned, if we're starting with that kind of neutral object that we're working with, that can be tricky for clients who have no training experience. Whereas literally just having the dog look at something and saying yes or clicking when they look at the thing, I find is, it's couldn't be much simpler for a green client who has no experience with reactivity or with training. And so I do lean on engage disengage for that reason, because I find that it's just like so easy for people to execute. So now that I've described the two games, I want to talk about some of the commonalities between them. So both of these things are utilizing operant conditioning. And so what that means is that we're teaching the dog that when they do a certain behavior, there is a certain consequence. And that in terms of this game, it might be kind of reporting that thing to you. So indicating to you that they saw the thing in the look at that game, or looking at the thing or disengaging from the thing in engage disengage. So those things are not straight counter conditioning. So they do use they are requiring the dog to offer a behavior, and we're rewarding them for offering a specific behavior or a specific kind of set of behaviors. That being said, they also have a counter conditioning component to them. And that is why I like these games so much. They give the dog something to do when they see a trigger. And they also, because we're feeding every time they're kind of noticing the trigger or reporting the trigger, or kind of, we're having that one to one where we're working with triggers and we're getting lots of good food, we do get that counter conditioning side effect that we want, which basically means not only are we teaching our dog to do something else around a trigger, but we're also creating an association that that trigger usually predicts pretty good things for them. And so they gradually over time may start to feel better about the trigger. And if it's being done properly, they should start to feel better around the trigger. If they don't start to feel better, we want to think about what's going on, that they're not kind of succeeding at this. We may want to think about our setup. Is it too hard? Are they over threshold and therefore unable to learn in the way that we want them to? Um, but we really do want to see that maybe you're able to close distance, or make something about the trigger harder over time because the dog is getting that like happy feeling about working with the trigger, and so they're less worried. Both of these games do involve looking at the thing. As I said, Leslie McDevitt would not consider Look at That game to be about looking, even though it's called the Look at That game, but as much as it is about having that two-way conversation. But regardless of how you describe it, there is a component of in Look at That of looking at the thing. Um, and Engage Disengage is the same. So they both have that commonality where, unlike something where if we're looking at kind of the balance side of training, using aversive methods, we're correcting the dog. So maybe in that situation, the trainer is not letting the dog look at that thing and correcting them for looking at the thing. So it's kind of the opposite of what I'm talking about today. And then we also have positive reinforcement based trainers who use strategies where they ask the dog to look at them around the trigger, or to leave it around the trigger. And so there's other strategies where we're asking the dog to actually not look at the trigger or not to notice them. Those are not the strategies that I favor, but there's nothing wrong with those strategies necessarily. However, they essentially, that's just the commonality between the two and how they differ from other things. Um, they typically both Engage, Disengage, and Look at That are used as behavior modification. And so if you're not familiar, basically when we're working with reactivity, or any type of behavior, honestly, we're looking at there's kind of two branches to the training. The first branch is management, and so that's all of the things that you're doing day to day to prevent your dog from reacting, practicing the reactivity, prevent them from having bad experiences, keeping them stress free. All of those things are management. Maybe you're using kind of damage control strategies to get out of Dodge if there is an issue. But Look at That and Engage, Disengage are typically used as part of a behavior modification uh, protocol. And so that's the other branch. So if we have management, which is like our prevention, stress reduction, um, piece. Then on the other side, we have behavior modification, which is, hey, I'm going to take you out and I'm going to set you up at a distance that I think you can handle this trigger. Or maybe I'm going to utilize a helper person or a helper dog to practice with. And I'm going to intentionally try to change how you react to this trigger. And so that's what we would consider behavior modification. And that is where Look at That and Engage, Disengage typically kind of fit in. And that's where we're trying to work under threshold where the dog is relaxed, or as relaxed as they can be, as much as possible. Now let's talk about some of the differences. So Look at That, as I mentioned, is less about looking and more about in like having a conversation and reporting the trigger, turning the dog into a reporter, as Leslie says. Um, and so that is one difference from Engage, Disengage, because I haven't talked to Alice, but based on all of the instructions I've seen for Engage, Disengage, and executing it myself, it is about looking. It is about looking, and it is about looking away. And so I don't think there's any denying that. So that's a little bit different in terms of like the way that these things are meant to be used and are described, is that like, teaching the dog to report things to you and have a conversation with you, and actually teaching the dog to look at that thing, and look away from that thing. Could you say that engage, disengage has a component of conversation? Of course, because anything that you're doing with your reactive dog should have this two-way communication component. And so when we know body language and we're kind of looking at body language and listening to what our dog is telling us with their body, when we start to understand what they look like when they go over threshold and we start to understand what their triggers are and what makes them harder and what makes them easier, and when we teach our dog to respond to cues and engage with us, all of these things are conversation, right? They're all ways of having that two-way conversation with your dog. So I don't think that conversation is specific to look at that. I think engage, disengage has a component of that. And I think what one thing that we see from engage, disengage is that we do get kind of that reporting side effect where the dog notices the thing and looks back at you, and you might even not even know the trigger is there until your dog is like, hey, I see it, right? And so I think it's not like look at that as a conversation and engage, disengage is not. I think they both have elements of that, but I think it's worth noting kind of how they're described and how they're used. The other thing I really like about look at that is that it can be used as a heads up, like I mentioned before. So engage, disengage doesn't really have that component because it doesn't have that cue. Engage, disengage doesn't have like a thing that you say to your dog to prompt them to look. Whereas look at that has the where's the dog, where's the trigger. And so if your dog is startled, you can use it for that, like I mentioned, to give them a heads up. Look at that typically has foundation work with that neutral object. Engage, disengage does not, but that doesn't mean that a lot of trainers aren't teaching some type of foundation with engage, disengage. And so foundation could be anything that you're practicing with that is not the trigger and just getting your dog used to the game. And of course, like I mentioned, look at that has a cue, or some people would say command. We like to say cue usually, but look at that has a verbal cue. Engage, disengage does not. Okay, so those are some of the differences. I do want, before we wrap up, to talk about some of the things that I see happening with these games that can be problematic. And this is not blaming the games, this is blaming the execution. And it's really easy as a novice trainer to make these mistakes. I think a lot of professional trainers make these mistakes too, especially if they're kind of earlier on in their career. I know I have. So I do think it's important to talk about it and kind of give you a heads up about what some of the mistakes are that I see and how we can maybe prevent them. So look at that has that cue that where's the thing, right? If we're not careful to only use that cue when we think our dog is okay, one thing that I've seen come out of look at that is that you can have a dog where where's the dog or where's the stranger can become aversive to them. And so what I mean by that is that they hear that cue and they start to get scared. It starts to predict a scary situation because if we're always using where's the dog when the dog is going to be super close up and scary to your dog, then it's not serving its purpose in terms of like having that nice conversation. It's actually acting as a scary, like, watch out, there's a dog coming. And so your dog might start to tense up. They might start to scan. Oh no, she said, where's the dog? Oh, where is it? Where is it? I'm getting scared. That's really what we don't want. And so if we use it too much when our dog is over threshold, that can happen. I personally made that mistake with my own dog at the very beginning of my training career when I first learned about look at that. I was using it a lot where she was in kind of like the yellow zone. And so I always describe threshold like a stoplight. And so if we have red zone, like full blown reaction, green zone, totally relaxed, yellow zone is that middle place where our dog is maybe concerned, anxious, not accepting treats, taking treats harder. And a lot of dogs can still kind of do training things in that zone, but that doesn't mean that they're okay. And so with my dog, what I was doing is I was saying, where's the dog? And she would look at the dog, look back at me, I'd give her a treat, we'd practice, but she, like, her body language was telling me that when she heard where's the dog, she was panicking. So you want to be really careful not to use that cue if your dog is not relaxed. Is that easier said than done? Yes, because sometimes when they're in that yellow zone, we don't really know until it's too late. But I just want you to do your best to only use it when you think your dog is okay. The other thing we can do with the cue is we can weaken it by using it when it's not strong enough. So if we have practiced with the neutral object a couple times, and we then go out and try to practice with the trigger, even if the trigger is at a okay intensity and okay distance for our dog to be successful in terms of like being relaxed and not reacting, um, if our dog doesn't like understand the game well enough, or they don't have enough practice with the game, what can happen is you're saying, "Where's the dog? Where's the dog? Where's the dog?" And the dog isn't really responding to it, and they don't really know what you mean. Maybe they don't even look at the dog, and then you've kind of weakened the cue by not using it, um, when your dog is actually likely to look. And so that can be a bit tricky, honestly. But what I would say, and what I usually advise people to do, is go into your chosen setup, wait for your dog to look at the trigger a couple times, and you can say yes or click and kind of get into that mode of like, okay, you looked, yes, you looked, yes. If your dog is consistently kind of getting the game, looking back at the trigger, then I would add in the cue. Because if you add it in too early and your dog doesn't know what they're supposed to be doing, the cue is going to lose all meaning. The other thing that I would warn you about, and this honestly, this applies to any training. This doesn't just apply to the look at that game or engage, disengage. But I always warn people about this. Some dogs, and I would say even many dogs, will participate in training games when they are not okay. This especially applies to dogs who are working breeds. Um, I'm looking at you, herding breeds. Herding breeds are notorious for this. They will participate in a game around a trigger until they go up and bite the trigger. So they will keep going because they enjoy training, they enjoy working with you. And so they may still do the game and be able to eat and be able to do all the things, but not be okay. And so that's where we really want to make sure that we're not looking at our dog and saying, "Can you do this game?" And if you can, then that's fine. We're looking at the whole picture and seeing, okay, yes, the dog is maybe listening to the cue and looking at the thing and eating, but do they look relaxed? Are they having to look back constantly? Like, are you rewarding them and they're just whipping their head back? Like they cannot look away from the thing. They can only look away just to eat the treat and then they have to stare at it. Because if your dog is really having to stare at something versus, just like a quick indication towards the thing, that tells me that like, okay, they're playing the game, but that they're not okay. We also want to look at just their body language in general. Like, are they stiff? How is their weight shifted? Can they lie down or sit down, or are they stuck in this like standing position because they're kind of getting ready in that fight or flight mode? So we really want to look at our dog and say, okay, you're playing the game, but are you actually okay? This can be difficult if you're just working on your own, and it's why it's beneficial to have a trainer helping you so they can help you to see the moments where your dog is okay and is not okay. Um, I'm going to give you a couple things that you can do right now. Um, and I call that a threshold test. And I did not invent threshold tests, but it's something that many trainers use. And the idea behind it is that we do something at the beginning of the training session to evaluate if our dog is okay, to continue training. And so the things that I would do before you even start trying to do engage, disengage, or look at that, I would look at your dog's body language, see how they look in general. Think about their baseline. What do they look like when there's no triggers around and they're totally relaxed? And how do they look now? And is that different? Okay. So you want to see if there's any signs in their body language that they're in distress. The second thing I want you to do is offer food. So I want you to offer food for free. You don't have to ask your dog to do anything. Offer food. And it should be food that they typically enjoy at home. Sometimes when we're outside, we may use like slightly higher value food, but that's like a whole other episode. I typically like to use a medium value food because I find that if the dog is only eating super, super, super high value, that tells me that they're probably not okay. So offer a medium value food that your dog usually likes. See if they eat it. If your dog is not eating, you cannot continue with this game. There's something going on. Okay. Um, if they are eating it, then I want you to go to the next step and I want you to ask, how are they eating it? So are they accepting it and then spitting it out? Are they eating it But like some dogs will eat it, but like it's almost like they're just like a robot, like they're mechanically eating it without actually thinking about it or engaging with the food. This is so anthropomorphizing the dog, but I always say like the dog is like eating it to be polite. Like that's how it comes across. Like the dog takes it and they eat it, but they're not really into the food at all. So that's one side of the spectrum, is like they don't eat food, or they're eating it in a way where they're not actually really eating it. Like they're eating it mechanically or they're spitting it out. And then the other side is eating the food in a way that is like painful. So like biting your hand really hard when they eat the food. Um, and we call that like a sharky mouth or a hard mouth. A lot of dogs, if they're stressing up, or just getting stressed in general, they're gonna really like bite down on your hand to the point where you're gonna say like, ow. And so we want to see that they're eating normally. So we don't want either ends of those spectrums going on. And then the next thing I want you to do, and the last thing before you get started on the training, is I want you to evaluate whether your dog can do the simplest behavior that you can think of. So sit is a behavior that 99% of dogs know, and they usually know it really well. It's usually the first behavior they're going to offer if someone has a treat or something. Touch is another one that your dog may know very well. I teach the pattern game, the up-down game, in my pattern games for reactivity and fear class. That is a very, very simple game that your dog, if they know it, they should be able to do it if they're relaxed. And so that last step where we're asking for really, really, really simple behavior, is the point of it is that if your dog can't do, a sit or something really easy that they know really well in this given situation that you're putting them in, they're probably not okay. Okay. So I hope this is helpful. I hope that if you were confused about the two games or you weren't sure which one to use, this gave you some information to think about. Both are honestly, like I said, I use these all the time. And both of them are amazing tools. And I think that's so great that we have these tools and these games accessible to us. You can make a huge amount of progress if you're doing these games properly. And so I think that they're like, I can't say enough good things about these games. I think they're so user friendly, they're so simple, and they're really great. There's no reason also that you can't teach your dog both these games. I probably wouldn't move between them in one training session just to not confuse your dog, but having more tools in your toolkit is always great. And there are a lot of parallels, so they do work well if your dog knows them both. Um, but you do want to make sure that you're kind of using them in a way that is going to be effective, and working under threshold. You don't want to be practicing these games when your dog is worried, if possible, okay, for the best chance of progress. If you need help with your reactive dog, there is information in the show notes about where to find me. If you feel like I didn't describe either of these games properly, please let me know. I'd be happy to have a conversation about it. But this is how I understand the games, based on what I've learned about them and what I teach. And I hope this has been helpful. Have a great day and enjoy training your dog. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Reactive Dog Pod. Please make sure to subscribe, rate, and review so more reactive dog guardians can find me. If you need help with your reactive dog, I offer one-on-one support, group training, and an online membership, all available virtually worldwide. Information on where to find me is in the show notes for each episode. Thanks again, and happy training!